Mark Levin's voice crashed across the studio like an unwelcome storm. His sharp, relentless words drowned out everything else. For the 18th time that night, he interrupted Jasmine Crockett, slicing her thought in half before it could finish. The studio audience shifted uneasily, the moderators exchanged glances, and millions watching at home felt the same frustration rise. Why wouldn't he let her speak? Crockett remained composed. No rolling of the eyes, no desperate attempts to yell back, just a steady posture with her hand resting lightly on the table, as if to ground herself against the waves of chaos crashing toward her. Levin leaned forward, his face flushed with satisfaction, his voice booming louder as if sheer volume could hide the weakness of his argument. Then she moved. Not much, just a lift of her hand, subtle but intentional, signaling both to him and to the country that enough was enough. Levin continued to rant, unaware, but the gesture held a power that silence alone could not convey. The studio, once rattling with his interruptions, seemed to pause. For a brief moment, the shouting became mere background noise, and the image of Jasmine Crockett standing her ground took center stage. The moment felt heavy, cinematic in its intensity. Viewers across the country leaned forward, feeling anger at the injustice and excitement for what would come next. Crockett didn't rush. She didn't need to. Sometimes patience is the sharpest weapon, and dignity the most potent response. Mark Levin finished his tirade, his words trailing off into a silence only he could mistake for victory. Crockett slowly lowered her hand, her eyes locked on him with a calm that cut deeper than any insult he had thrown. America watched, breath held, waiting for her response. What happened next would echo far beyond the studio lights, the panel table, and this one chaotic night. It would become the clash replayed in living rooms, classrooms, and news feeds across the nation. And Levin, still unaware, had already lost. Rewind the scene. Before the silence, before the raised hand, before the nation held its breath, there was the setup. A studio lit under bright lights, cameras circling with cold precision, and a stage designed not just for discussion but for confrontation. This was primetime television, where every word could become a viral moment and every gesture examined across the endless flow of American screens. Millions were watching. Millions were waiting. In the center sat two figures who couldn't have been more different. On one side, Mark Levin, the loud conservative firebrand, a man who thrived on sheer volume, a master of the monologue who seemed allergic to letting anyone else finish a thought. He thrived on dominating the table, bending the rules of conversation, until no one else could be heard. His fans expected it, his critics endured it, and tonight he wore that approach like armor. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, deliberate and measured. Where Levin barked, she breathed. Where he slammed his fists, she steadied her hands. She knew she wasn't just speaking for herself. She represented every voice that had ever been silenced, dismissed, or interrupted in spaces like this. For her, dignity wasn't just a strategy, it was essential. The stakes were high. This was not a closed hearing room or a backdoor political fight. It was live national television. Every interruption was not just a slight against Crockett, it sent a message to millions of women watching at home, millions of immigrants, and millions of young people who had been told their voices mattered only until someone louder decided otherwise. The battle on that stage was about more than talking points. It was about who gets to be heard in America and who is forced into silence. Levin didn't seem to grasp that. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. Every time he cut her off, every time his voice roared over hers, he reinforced an image that viewers could feel in their bones, arrogance on display. He believed that shouting louder meant winning, but he hadn't realized that millions were judging him not by his words but by his actions. And Crockett? She was patient. She let the interruptions pile up, knowing that sometimes the best way to win is to let the opponent dig their own grave. With every dismissive comment, every sneer, and every exaggerated outburst, Levin wasn't just undermining her. He was undermining himself. The cameras caught everything, the raised eyebrows of other panelists, the uneasy glance from the moderator, the murmurs in the audience as frustration grew. The story wrote itself in real time. One man too arrogant to stop. One woman too dignified to break. But here's the thing about arrogance. It digs holes faster than any opponent could. Each interruption didn't just silence Crockett. It buried Levin deeper. Swing after reckless swing. What no one knew, yet what even Levin himself hadn't realized, was that the grave he was digging was already wide open, and all it would take was one calm, devastating response from Jasmine Crockett to lower him into it, because patience, when wielded by the right person at the right moment, is not weakness. It is the quiet edge of history sharpening itself, and soon America would see it slice through arrogance like a knife to understand the significance of what happened that night. You need to know who Mark Levin was long before he stepped onto that stage. To millions of his listeners, Levin wasn't just a voice on the radio, he was the voice. A loud, relentless presence who branded himself as the Great One, a self-given title that reflected how he viewed himself in America's political dialogue. For decades, Levin built a career on the art of domination. He didn't just argue, he bulldozed. He didn't just debate. He dismantled, often through sheer force of personality. Night after night on the airwaves, he honed a style that thrived on anger and repetition. His fans loved how his voice could rise into a frenzy, how he spoke as if every word was a battle cry and every opponent an existential threat. He positioned himself as the defender of law and order, the last line of resistance against what he described as chaos. Yet the irony was glaring for a man who preached about rules, discipline, and civility. Levin showed little regard for the most basic rule of debate, letting the other side speak. That contradiction followed him throughout his career. When challenged, he didn't shift to reason, he shifted to volume. When facts became inconvenient, he substituted fury. It was his formula, the secret to his longevity in a media environment where noise often overshadowed nuance. His audience didn't just tune in for information, they tuned in for the performance, for a sense of being led into battle by a general who never lowered his sword. But what works behind the safety of a radio microphone doesn't always translate under the bright lights of live television. On radio, Levin was untouchable. His interruptions invisible because no one saw the silenced guest, and there was no audience to witness the power imbalance. On stage, however, the mask slipped. Every cutoff, every sneer, every thunderous interruption revealed not strength but insecurity, and millions could see it unfold in real time. Still, Levin entered that night with the confidence of a man who had weathered storms before. He had sparred with politicians, mocked activists, dismantled professors, and reveled in every victory. To him, another debate was just another chance to remind America of his dominance. He thought his reputation would intimidate anyone who sat across from him. And to be fair, many before Crockett had faltered under his barrage, losing their rhythm, their message, and sometimes even their cool. But here's the flaw in Levin's approach. It depended on his opponent acting by his rules. It assumed the target would be shaken, silenced, or thrown off balance. It relied on the idea that arrogance was invincible. That night, Levin was about to meet the one competitor who refused to play the game his way. He entered the debate armed with everything that had worked before: his voice, his confidence, his crafted aura of inevitability. He thought the stage was his, the cameras his allies, the audience his supporters. But what he didn't realize was that his very tactics, the interruptions, the overbearing tone, the refusal to share space, were no longer just quirks of personality. They had become symbols of something bigger, something uglier. To viewers at home, Levin wasn't merely arguing. He was embodying the culture of silencing, the arrogance of those who mistake volume for truth. And that's what made him dangerous. Not because his arguments were flawless, but because his style of domination had worked for so long, shaping so many conversations through brute force. For years, he had convinced his audience that aggression equaled authority, that to win meant to overwhelm. He had turned debate into theater, outrage into fuel. He was a formidable force simply because he had rarely faced real opposition. But here's the thing about arrogance. It blinds. It convinces you that past victories guarantee future wins. It tells you that if the formula has always worked, it always will. It whispers that regardless of the opponent, regardless of the setting, you are untouchable. For Levin, that whisper had become gospel. So, on that night, he leaned into his old tactics harder than ever. 18 interruptions. 18 attempts. To prove that the old formula still packed a punch. 18 moments when he chose bluster over respect, volume over dignity, each one more desperate than the last. Each one eroding the very authority he thought he was defending, yet for all his noise, for all the years of dominance, for all the audiences that had cheered his anger, Mark Levin had no idea what was about to hit him. Before Jasmine Crockett took her place at the debate table, under the bright studio lights and facing one of the most outspoken conservative voices in America, she had already fought many battles. Her journey didn't start with a microphone or a camera. It began in courtrooms, neighborhoods, and long nights filled with the weight of others, struggles resting heavily on her shoulders. Crockett began her career as a lawyer, not the kind who hides behind plush offices and corporate deals, but the kind who entered courtrooms on behalf of those who could not afford to stay silent. She defended the overlooked, the tenants evicted unjustly, the young people unfairly targeted and prosecuted, the families crushed by a system that often worked against them. The cases weren't glamorous, they didn't grab headlines, but they taught her a discipline that few achieve, the ability to stand firm, to argue clearly, and most importantly, to listen when everyone else was shouting. Her path was challenging. As a young black woman entering a profession dominated by the old guard, she was often underestimated before she even spoke. Judges overlooked her, opposing counsel brushed her off. There were whispered comments, too young, too inexperienced, too radical. But every doubt aimed at her became motivation. She didn't raise her voice to respond. She let her preparation, sharp mind, and relentless work ethic do the talking. Each dismissal turned into a lesson in restraint, a lesson in how to transform anger into purpose. This discipline propelled her into politics. Running for office wasn't about ego. It was about extending her fight for justice beyond the courtroom. Yet the challenges didn't disappear with a campaign banner. Skepticism followed her. Was she tough enough? Did she belong in the halls of power? Could someone without privilege genuinely succeed in Congress? Again, she chose patience over anger, persistence over theatrics. She knocked on doors, listened to constituents, and built trust step by step. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett was not just another freshman representative. She was the result of years of resilience tested by fire. She carried the voices of those she defended in court, the communities she fought for in campaigns, and the hard truth that every ounce of progress had to be earned. She understood what it meant to be dismissed before speaking, interrupted before finishing, and challenged just for being in places not designed for her. Because she understood, she was ready. Her calm in the face of chaos didn't come from natural serenity. It was a skill shaped by years of being underestimated. Every time she was interrupted in a courtroom, every time her ideas were ignored in political meetings, every time someone told her she couldn't, those moments forged her composure. To outsiders, her quiet patience seemed like restraint. In reality, it was strategy. It was strength hidden in stillness. That's why, when Mark Levin continually spoke over her, Crockett didn't flinch. She had faced this situation before, not with him, not on national television, but in countless other situations where loud voices tried to drown hers out. The difference now was the scale. This wasn't just another courtroom. This was a national media stage where millions would see whether dignity could surpass arrogance. She understood the stakes, but she did not panic. She never rushed, because Crockett knew something Levin didn't. Silence, when used wisely, can be louder than noise. Waiting for the right moment can be more effective than rushing into conflict. Her strength was not in matching his fury, but in letting his fury reveal itself, until she only needed to step in with precision and deliver the line that changed everything. When that moment came, when the interruptions piled up, and the tension reached a breaking point, Crockett was prepared. She had been preparing for years because this went beyond her. It was about every woman told to calm down while making a point. It was about every immigrant whose story was cut short by louder voices insisting they didn't belong. It was about every underdog silenced and dismissed, waiting for someone. To show that patience can be strength, Jasmine Crockett didn't inherit unshakable calm. She earned it one battle at a time. Now, under the glare of cameras and the arrogance of Mark Levin, that hard-earned composure was about to face its ultimate test. This was the very fire that shaped the composure. Now tested under the nation's spotlight. The tension was already thick. But what followed turned it into a national spectacle. Each time Jasmine Crockett began to speak, Mark Levin interrupted. It wasn't just 1 or 2 moments, it was nonstop. He cut her off mid-sentence, mid-thought, even mid-word, his booming voice drowning hers as if volume alone could silence her. The cameras caught everything. On one side of the screen, Levin appeared red-faced, jabbing the air with his finger, his energy frantic and unchecked. On the other side, Crockett remained still, her chin slightly raised, her eyes steady, her hands folded neatly on the desk as if holding the weight of centuries of silenced voices. The contrast was striking. The audience at home felt it. Tweets flooded in during the broadcast. Let her speak. This is embarrassing. Why is he so afraid of her words? Hashtags began forming in real time as millions watched Levin spiral into chaos while Crockett stood her ground with silence more powerful than his shouting. Every interruption grew more frantic. Levin's points didn't resonate, but he couldn't help himself. He barreled over her responses, filling the air with noise, as if afraid that allowing her even one moment without interruption would reveal how weak his arguments truly were. Amid it all, Crockett remained unflinching. She didn't roll her eyes, she didn't snap back, she waited. With each attack, insult, and interruption, her calmness became more commanding. Her quiet presence turned into its own kind of challenge, the discipline of a trial lawyer who knows. That silence can be the loudest argument. The camera zoomed in on her face during one particularly harsh interruption. Levin's words overflowed into a rant, his voice rising, his gestures wild. Yet Crockett's shot showed nothing but composure, an embodiment of quiet strength. Viewers at home leaned in. They were no longer just watching a debate. They were witnessing a clash of wills. The more Levin shouted, the smaller he seemed. The more Crockett waited, the larger she appeared. The studio audience felt it too. Murmurs began to rise low, then louder as people exchanged glances as if to ask, how long can this continue? Even the moderators shifted uneasily in their chairs, recognizing the unfolding imbalance. And then it happened. For the 18th time, Levin spoke over her. His rant continued, but this time Crockett did something new. She leaned forward slightly, her hand rising no higher than her chest. That subtle movement changed everything. The studio picked up on it, the cameras locked in, and suddenly the energy shifted. Levin continued to talk louder, sharper, desperately, but the silence surrounding Crockett's stillness drew focus. Like a magnetic force. Viewers across America instinctively hushed, anticipating what would come next, and then, the moment arrived, Crockett finally leaned into the microphone. The studio fell silent, as if every person understood that history was about to be made. The shouting had reached its peak. Now it was time for the answer that would resonate beyond the studio walls. Section 6. The mic drop counterattack, 1,100 words. The studio had grown accustomed to Levin's interruptions, so much so that it almost felt normal. He would raise his voice, cut off a thought, hammer down on a sentence like a relentless hammer striking the same nail. But after the 18th time, the rhythm shifted. For the first time that night, Levin stopped speaking, not because he wanted to, but because he had run out of energy. His voice fell into silence, and the weight of his words hung long enough for the cameras to capture it. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. She didn't rush her response. She didn't scramble to reclaim the time. She simply let the silence linger. Seconds dragged on, heavy with anticipation. The audience inside the studio went still, and millions across the nation leaned closer to their screens. Crockett's eyes locked onto Levin, and in that silence, power shifted. When she finally spoke, her tone was calmer than anyone expected. "Are you finished?" she asked softly. No sarcasm, no raised voice, just a deliberate question. That cut deeper than any insult. The audience let out nervous chuckles. Levin narrowed his eyes, but before he could reply, Crockett continued. "You've interrupted me 18 times tonight," she said, pausing between each word as if laying stones on a path. 18 times you decided that your voice mattered. More than mine. And yet not once have you allowed an idea to stand alone. Because, Mr. Levin, shouting is not the same as making a point, gasps rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, slow, precise. Each syllable carried weight, as if every pause had been rehearsed by history itself. Levin attempted to laugh it off, but his smirk faltered when Crockett pressed on. "You talk about law and order. You present yourself as the guardian of discipline. Yet, when given the simplest rule of debate, let the other person finish you, break it time and again. If you can't respect the order of this room, how can you claim to speak for the order of this nation?" Her words struck with force, not shouted but wielded with surgical precision. Levin shifted in his chair, his bravado shaken by the mirror she held up to him. For the first time, his interruptions looked less like strength and more like desperation. Crockett let the silence return, her gaze steady. The audience held its breath, as if even a cough would shatter the spell she had cast. Then she leaned in closer, her voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Real strength isn't about talking over people. It's knowing when to listen. Real courage isn't silencing others, it's daring to let them be heard. You've spent your career mistaking volume for power, but tonight America sees the difference. Because dignity doesn't need to shout." The room erupted. Some clapped, others gasped, and even the commentators froze, unsure whether to interrupt the moment or let it stand alone. Levin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He sat there, visibly rattled, a man who had always defined himself by dominance suddenly stripped of it in front of millions. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned her attention back to the moderators, reclaiming her time without asking for it. Her composure spoke louder than his 18 interruptions combined, and yet she wasn't finished. With quiet authority, she delivered her final line. "This country doesn't need another man shouting at the top of his lungs. It needs leaders who can stay calm at the bottom of the storm." For a moment there was nothing. The nation was in stunned silence, processing what it had just heard. Commentators shuffled their notes, uncertain how to respond. The audience's applause built slowly, then erupted into a roar. Social media lit up within seconds as clips were shared and hashtags formed. Levin's face told the story better than words could. The smirk was gone, and so was his confidence. What remained was a man staring at the wreckage of his tactics, brought down not by shouting but by 30 words spoken with calm clarity. With those 30 words she ended 30 years of noise. As soon as Jasmine Crockett's calm response left her lips, the studio audience felt it like a thunderclap. But outside those walls, the real impact was just beginning. Within seconds, clips of the exchange appeared on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Phones lit up across the country as people shared the 30 words that had turned decades of Levins' noise into rubble. By the end of the debate, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Conveyes Chaos was the first, as users compared Crockett's serene demeanor with Levin's red-faced interruptions. Then came hashtag Let Her Speak, a rallying cry from women who had been talked over in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms. Memes spread rapidly, Levin as a storm cloud, Crockett as an unshakable stone. TikTok creators remixed her final line into beats, lip syncs, and parody skits. On YouTube, reaction videos multiplied by the hour with creators pausing mid-clip to shake their heads at Levin's unraveling. The numbers reflected the moment. Millions of views overnight and tens of millions by the end of the week. Crockett's response wasn't just a moment in a debate. It was a cultural touchstone. People who had never engaged in politics recognized her face, repeating her words in comment sections and sharing their own stories of being silenced. The confrontation struck a nerve that resonated across demographics. Locations and identities, cable news, eager for ratings, replayed the footage repeatedly. Commentators who had previously dismissed Crockett as an underdog now praised her composure as a brilliant strategy. This wasn't just being calm, one anchor stated. It was a dismantling, methodical, deliberate, effective. Another described it as Levin's career-ending mistake, noting that in his attempt to dominate, he exposed his inability to handle being challenged. Even conservative outlets, usually quick to protect Levin, couldn't ignore the narrative. Headlines sought to soften his image. Levin gets heated, but the clips revealed the truth. No amount of spin could alter the visual contrast. A man shouting and red-faced, a woman calm, clear, and unshaken. At last, the optics were undeniable. Behind the scenes, producers discussed Levin's future on television. While ratings might rise short-term, his credibility suffered a blow. Political insiders speculated that his tactics, once seen as powerful, now seemed outdated in a time when younger audiences value authenticity over volume. "It's not 1995 anymore," one strategist remarked. "People don't want bullhorns, they want genuine voices." Crockett's star continued to rise. Invitations flooded in for interviews, keynote speeches, and late-night appearances. For her supporters, she became a symbol not just of a politician, but of dignity in the face of pride and strength in the midst of performative anger. Her moment was not a lucky break. It was the culmination of her journey, proving that patience, preparation, and composure can triumph in the loudest arenas, yet the impact wasn't limited to admiration. For many viewers, the exchange resonated on a personal level. Women shared their frustrations, feeling validated on screen. Immigrants and first-generation Americans related to Crockett's patience as a reflection of their families' learned restraint in workplaces and schools. The story transcended politics. It became a mirror where millions saw themselves by week's end. Analysts compared the clip to historic political moments that changed perceptions of power. But this wasn't about a clever line or a sharp comeback. It was about contrasting styles, moral clarity facing arrogance, the undeniable truth that dignity can silence chaos more effectively than raised voices. The ripple effects continued. While the digital world buzzed, deeper impacts began to emerge. Lawmakers referenced the exchange on the House floor. Opinion pieces highlighted it as a crucial point in how Americans discuss respect, civility, and representation. Even voters who claimed to dislike politics admitted they were glued to their screens. For Mark Levin, the fallout was clear. For Jasmine Crockett, the triumph was solid. But for the nation, the real story was just beginning. The impact wasn't just digital, it touched the very heart of America's political debate. Asterisk as the debate faded to black, echoes of Mark Levin's interruptions lingered. Yet, what remained? More powerfully was the image of Jasmine Crockett, calm, steady, composed, turning the tide without ever raising her voice. It reminded everyone that in politics, like in life, there are two types of power, the kind that shouts to be heard and the kind that commands. Silence with dignity. Crockett understood something Levin never grasped. Arrogance shines bright but quickly burns out. Dignity, however, lasts. For every raised voice that seeks to silence others, there's a calm voice that outlasts it, shaping the future long after the noise has faded. Her response was more than just a reply. It was a real-time lesson showing that composure in the face of disrespect is not weakness, is strength at its highest level. The broader meaning resonated profoundly for viewers across the nation. In a democracy, drowning out your opponent is not a display of strength. It reveals insecurity. True conviction doesn't need to stifle other voices. It welcomes challenge and responds with clarity. Crockett embodied that on live television. She demonstrated that the future of debate and democracy belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who stand firm amid the noise. For her supporters, the moment meant even more. It wasn't just about Crockett standing up for her dignity. It was about her defending the dignity of everyone who has been dismissed, interrupted, or silenced. It was for every woman who had been overlooked in meetings, every immigrant overlooked, in classrooms, and every marginalized voice told to wait its turn. That night, her restraint wasn't passive, it was resistance. It was representation. In the silence following her words, viewers felt something rare in politics: pride. Pride that someone could maintain such grace under pressure. Pride that a calm truth could resonate more deeply than any insult. Pride that dignity wasn't merely surviving in American democracy, it was thriving. Commentators called it a turning point. Not because it defeated Levin, though it did, but because it revealed something more significant. It showed that America craved a new kind of leadership, one that values clarity over chaos, one that doesn't equate loudness with strength. Crockett's composure wasn't just a personal victory. It was a cultural one, signaling that perhaps the age of noise was finally coming to an end. As the clip continued to gain traction, a quiet agreement took hold among viewers. Whether they loved or disagreed with her politics, they couldn't deny the impact of her performance. It was proof that debates could uplift rather than degrade, inspire rather than drain energy. Thus, the story of that night became more than just Crockett versus Levin. It evolved into a parable about power itself. Power that is clutched too tightly crumbles. Power wielded with calm conviction endures. Crockett didn't just win a debate, she reframed the entire notion of victory. In the end, the real test of leadership isn't how loudly one speaks, but how deeply one's words can resonate. Her words echoed far and wide. They reached newsrooms and living rooms, timelines and headlines, touching the hearts of those who had almost lost hope in public discourse. They reminded people that hope can still exist in politics, that dignity can still overcome rage, and that, perhaps, was the true victory. In that studio, respect triumphed over rage and dignity shaped history. 18 times Mark Levin tried to take control, to interrupt, to overwhelm. Yet it took just one moment, one calm, powerful answer from Jasmine Crockett to turn years of bravado into a career-ending failure. This contrast is the heart of the story. For all his interruptions, noise, and attempts to dominate, Levin was undone not by someone louder, but by someone stronger. Crockett demonstrated that, in the end, it's not volume that wins. It's truth, delivered with calm conviction. It's dignity that outlasts arrogance. That's the lesson this moment imparts. Shouting may grab attention, but it can't earn respect. Only clarity, patience, and courage can achieve that. Crockett showed America that being composed amid chaos is not weakness, it's the true essence of power. If moments like this inspire you, if you believe dignity is worth defending, then join us. Subscribe and stay connected, as there will be more challenges where truth and respect must stand against arrogance and noise. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share it. Share it with someone who has been silenced, someone who has felt overlooked, someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters. Let this moment serve as proof that, even in the loudest room, calm courage can prevail. Beyond the sparks of a single debate, there's a deeper truth that unites us. Democracy thrives not when voices are suppressed, but when they are heard. And on that night, America listened. Respect triumphed over rage. Dignity shaped history. Together, we can ensure it happens again.